Today, the borders in Queensland are closed. It's for our own good, to protect our lives. Huh? What good? Protect our lives? Give me a break. The PM told the Nine Network last Wednesday that the National Cabinet has never agreed that there should be borders closed in Australia. That was never the medical expert advice that came at any time. We've gone from flattening the curve to eradication. The curve hasn't just been flattened, it's in steep decline, and we will not, until we have a vaccine, ever eradicate the virus. So do we continue as we're doing now? Well, we shouldn't, but we are. It's simply about power and control. If National Cabinet never agreed to any sort of domestic closure of our borders, then why are we doing it? Australia's Deputy Chief Medical Officer and leading expert on infectious diseases, Professor Paul Kelly, says it's safe to open the domestic borders. Now, when it came to school closures in Queensland, Queensland's Chief Health Officer Jeanette Young said, sometimes it's more than just science and the health. It's about the messaging. So what is the message with a border closure? It is simply about politics and power. And that is why Mike Kaiser, a political strategist and whiz kid, has been employed as a consultant to the Queensland government, advising on its COVID-19 response as the Queensland Premier launches a defence of her border closures. What would Mike Kaiser know? He's not a medical expert, he is a political expert. And the messaging you watch, trust, caring, credibility, and continuous cash handouts. That'll be the order of the day, and every day until October 31.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Today we catch up with John Blackburn, Chairman of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research Australia, and he says that just about all of our medicine supply chain is vulnerable.
Australia, unlike a lot of other countries, doesn't require the industry to hold minimum stock levels. So when something goes wrong, it goes wrong badly.
There's pressure on the federal government to divert some of the $60 billion JobKeeper savings into a package for the tourism sector. Chief Operating Officer for Accor Hotels Pacific, Simon McGrath, believes this should continue until at least December.
It still will be a tough way back post that, in 2021 will be a continual gradual build. So I think, what we want to do is try and get people into a December period, which is a much more positive period.
Professor Nikolai Petrovsky, Professor of Medicine at Flinders University, is set to become the first researcher in Australia to trial a COVID-19 vaccine in humans within weeks.
I think you need to appreciate it. A typical vaccine takes 15 years to develop. So the only way in which you can develop a vaccine faster than that is if you have most of the technology and components already sorted out.
And China's controversial national security laws for Hong Kong have been called a killer blow to the city's autonomy and freedom. We catch up with the managing editor of the Epoch Times in Hong Kong, Cheryl Ng.
Hong Kong is a very precious place for the world because the mentality in Hong Kong, the standards in Hong Kong is like such a city doesn't build in one day. It took years to build. So it can see like this is a precious frontier for the world to face the CCP. And as you see that the CCP's, like I said, the CCP's ambition is not in Hong Kong, it's the world. It's targeting the world.
And finally, don't forget to subscribe. Coming up next, John Blackburn.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
John Blackburn is a consultant in the field of defence and national security. In 2007, he was appointed an officer in the military division of the Order of Australia. He holds a Master of Arts and a Master of Defence Studies. John has extensive experience across the fields of strategy, policy, planning, operational command, capability development, and material acquisition. He is chairman of the Institute of Integrated Economics Research Australia, the Institute for Regional Security, and Australian Strategic Policy Institute Council member. John retired from the Royal Australian Air Force in 2008 as the Deputy Chief of the Air Force, following a career as a fighter pilot, test pilot and strategic planner. John's senior posts include Commander of the Integrated Area Defence System, located in Malaysia, commanding a multinational headquarters established to effect the 5 power defence arrangements, and head of strategic policy in the Defence Headquarters. John, first of all, welcome.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you.
The Institute for Integrated Economic Research Australia released a report this year looking at Australia's medical supply chain. Now, the report notes that Australia imports over 90% of medicines and is at the end of a very long global supply chain, making the nation vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. What type of medicines did your report look at, John?
Well, it's basically all of them. We make about 10% of our medicines in Australia, and these are ones that are on patent. But what's happened is because of pricing, generics, for example, are mostly imported. And when you actually trace back through, as best we can, where our medicines come from, it's a very complicated and opaque supply chain. So basically, look at vast majority of medicines. We're not sure what the supply chain looks like. We don't know what the risks are. And Australia, unlike a lot of other countries, doesn't require the industry to hold minimum stock levels. So when something goes wrong, it goes wrong badly.
Given that we import most of our pharmaceuticals from the US and they import the ingredients or the inputs mostly from China, is the US as vulnerable as we are?
Absolutely. And the reason we looked at this, because the medicine supply chain is only one of a range of aspects that we've looked at in our institute. In the middle of last year, a United States Commission inquiry into the United States' dependence on China for medicines and medical supplies highlighted a whole bunch of risks which they said was a risk to their national security. So we contacted one of the authors of a book called China RX, who had presented to that commission and had a long conversation. And then we said, hang on, if you're having that problem, surely we are. So we started digging into it. And yes, we have the problem. 21 or 2% of our medicines come via the US, 57% comes by the European Union, and they've all got the same problem. So we've got a serious problem we have to address.
China is also the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world, supplying about 20% of the global supply. So even if scientists can develop a vaccine for Covid-19, how high are the risks that we would be relying on China to either make it or supply, say, the ingredients to manufacturers?
Oh, significantly. The exact percentage we can't tell you because there's no analysis of it. Strangely, that report our institute put out appears to be the only public report in Australia about these supply chain risks. So the current situation is it's a serious problem. To do something about it requires a policy and a strategy, not only for medicines, but a whole range of things that says, how do we make Australia more resilient? But right now in a crisis, we're dealing with that reality.
Your report made some recommendations. What were they and what has been the reaction from Canberra?
What we're basically saying is you can't address any problem if you don't do a risk analysis, whether it's fuel, which I've done a lot of work in, or medicines, or a whole range of areas. So number one, we've got to do a proper risk assessment and analysis of our medicine supply chains and for medical equipment, because remember we ran out of masks during the bushfires? Mm-hmm. Well, exactly the same problem there. So number one, do a risk assessment. And then number two, when you look at it, you've got to make some decisions. What level of capability should we have that's guaranteed? So what do we want to be manufactured or produced or managed in Australia? And then for the rest of it, because the medicines are pretty important, how do we actually address the supply chains to make sure they're trusted? In other words, they're transparent, verifiable. And a part of that is you've got to say we need to keep a certain amount of medicines in stock. So we don't require any in Australia, but for example, the Finnish government requires that for 1,457 critical medicines, they must maintain between 3 and 10 months of stock in the country, depending on what they are.
That's amazing and fairly scary if you think about it. What can be done right away? What's stopping us then stockpiling the most needed drugs?
Where are you going to get them from? That's what's stopping us. So essentially, we've seen things like India restrict exports of its medicines, and they're a very large medicine supplier, because the active pharmaceutical ingredients they depend upon also come from China. So they closed down some of their exports, and you've seen this happen across the world. In the middle of a crisis, all you can do is manage as best you can, which is what we're doing. But we failed to prepare for the crisis, so we have significant risks. Now, once we get through this crisis, we've got to make sure we're better prepared for the next one.
Well, when this virus hit, why didn't they then direct, say, maybe all the funding to isolation and health, such as hospitals, ICU? Why do you think they closed down the economy?
The only thing you can do in a crisis is take the best reaction possible. And the issue here was, with some of the projections and the analysis that had been done prior to this, the best thing you can do is stop the infection rate growing rapidly, because it's not just a medicine issue. What we didn't publish in our report, because we didn't think it was probably productive to do this, is that when you start looking at Australia's hospital capacity, we have some serious challenges. We have 25% less hospital beds per 1,000 people than the OECD average. And in Australia, prior to the pandemic, this was about 3.7 beds per 1,000 people if you add up the private and public hospital system. Japan, for example, has 12, and I think Korea had 8. So many, many more tons of hospital beds. Prior to the pandemic, we only had 2,200 ventilators. And there's been a lot of work trying to build that. The problem being is that to use a ventilator, there are 3 critical drugs you need. They're in short supply. So even if you've got the ventilators, if you haven't got the drugs, you've got a problem. So the only thing you can do in a crisis is try and stop the virus growing to its potential, because it would have overwhelmed the hospital system, and that would have been bad. So what I think the government, federal and state governments, did was really smart and showed a really good way to work as a team in a crisis.
Now, you've been pretty critical of our stockpile of crude oil. Aussie government spending $94 million, if not already, to begin building up a stockpile of crude oil, but will initially store the fuel in the US. Now, I sort of think maybe not so secure, because the only way to get it to Australia is by sea. Are we still as vulnerable?
Oh, absolutely. That makes no difference whatsoever to our domestic energy security. And I said this to the Energy Minister recently. So it's back to the same principle. When you look at a supply chain, you've got to do a risk analysis. And that's what I've been arguing since 2011. And thankfully, Andrew Hastie, as the chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence Security, did raise with that committee a task on government to do a liquid fuel security review. Let's understand what our risk is. That review was supposed to be done by the end of 2018. It still hasn't been done, and the report's sitting on the Energy Minister's desk. Now, once you look at what your risks are, you then come up with a plan and a strategy, what you're going to do about it. Well, we don't have that. So going off and just buying some oil in America might be a way to buy some cheap oil, but it's not part of a strategy or plan that we know about. And therefore, what's the point? Let's do the risk analysis and work out how to make things more secure here. Putting oil in the American caverns is not going to make it more secure here.
Government ministers and bureaucrats then are paid a lot of money to sort these things out. Why aren't they attending to these matters? And why are they wasting so much time? And is it sort of on the back burner? It's not that important, and every now and then it might just sort of spike up.
Well, I found this problem on both sides of politics. When I first started this, the Labor government was there, and I spoke with the Labor Energy Minister, who I think half comically but half seriously suggested I should just go away and focus on defence problems like a good little boy. But, I've dealt with bullies before, so I just ignored him, and that motivated me to do something about this. So both sides of politics haven't addressed it. Why? Well, there's pretty strong focus from the industry lobbies, where the money is. Oh, look, there's not a problem. We can manage everything. Don't give us any regulation and control. Just go away. And so successive governments have gone along with that pressure from industry to, oh, look, don't worry, there's nothing to see here. It even got to the stage where the Department of Energy said, I think last year, oh, we haven't had a problem for 30 years, so there's nothing to worry about. It requires, unfortunately, a crisis or a trigger before we all go, oh, perhaps we should do something. The Covid-19 crisis is a trigger for us to say, hell, we've just been surprised. But if you've done any research on these things in the past, you wouldn't have been. This now gives us an opportunity to have a different conversation with the Australian public.
Now, you hate fake media, obviously. You're involved in the Very Media project at verymedia.org. which says democracies only function if voters can make well-informed decisions. Once we lose the ability to know and understand, they are ultimately doomed, and votes are bought by the people with the largest budgets who can afford to define their version of the truth. Tell us about the project and its aims.
Well, the aims of this project were being run by our sister organisation in Europe, the AAR there. And their intent was, seeing all this fake media problem, is how can we set up, not just single, but be a part of a network of media verification areas where that can be analysed, look at the various range of research, a bit like ABC fact-checked in some ways, but this was an independent group that they were looking at, to try and say, look, we've looked into this doesn't look quite right, there's a problem here. The reason being is this: democracies do not function without open discussion and media. And that, to me, is one of the most fundamental things. If that media ownership becomes concentrated only in the hands of a few very rich people, then there is a potential for that being distorted. And also, as we're seeing in America, there's a lot of almost political argument about fake medias, etc., which really undermines people's confidence in it. If you've got a way of verifying it, then you can have a trusted media, and that is essential for us. We have to have robust discussion in the media that's trusted, and that can't come about by just single organisations or a small number. And that was the intent of Verimedia.
President Trump signed an executive order to fight online censorship by technology corporations, including social media platforms. Let me play you a grab from the signing of the order to fight online censorship.
A small handful of powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communications in the United States. And we know what they are. We don't have to name them. We're going to give you a complete listing. We're going to give you a signed copy of what I'm going to be signing in a couple of minutes, and you'll see exactly what we're doing. They've had unchecked power to censor, restrict, edit, shape, hide, alter virtually any form of communication between private citizens or large public audiences. There's no precedent in American history for so small a number of corporations to control so large a sphere of human interaction.
The White House says, and I quote, tech bias is a major issue facing our democracy. It challenges the free exchange of ideas and public debate that protects our civil liberties. Every citizen, liberal, conservative or otherwise, has a right to be heard and treated fairly online. What's your thoughts on that?
I think as a principle about a fair, an open media and open communications is important. I think there need to be some issues there when you get some of the racial dimensions playing into it. And I think in Australia we've got some legislation. In the US, whilst there are many good aspects there, as having lived there for a number of years as you have, what I see right now is almost a political civil war occurring. And the problem there being is that where there are problems, there are also those on the political side. And in the case of President Trump, his behaviour, clear distortion of facts over times, I just don't have any faith in anything that he would be saying at the present time. The principle underlying that we have to have an active media that doesn't censor things in areas, and therefore a diverse media, I agree with, but I just could never go along with what President Trump's saying.
Most people have a sense of what fake news may be, but do we know anything about interest-driven media that promotes false facts for its own ends? And who are these organisations and people, and how can they be outed?
That was the intent with Verimedia, and the challenge that has run into there is trying to get the funding to make it run, because a lot of these, like our institute, we're self-funded. And in Europe, they had some funding, but limited. They're still trying to do it if they can get it. But you can imagine a range of different groups trying to do the Verimedia thing provides public with an option to look at different sources, in this case that are not controlled by a large business or financial interest, to give them the opportunity to make their own decision. Now, you have to have it open from all sides of politics and perspectives. And that's what Verimedia was trying to do. Challenge, of course, comes is trying to get the funding to do it. As we're seeing in Australia today, with large number of media institutions or areas being closed down because of funding reasons, that's a serious loss, I think, of discussion capability in a democratic country. Your
experience in defence and national security, just offshore we have the dragon getting angrier with China, with India, with Taiwan, and also with the South China Sea. Where do you see all this, and also, sorry, can't forget Hong Kong, where do you see all this heading? Are they being a little bit too sensitive, or are they actually starting to muscle in?
I think it's the latter. I mean, they've been identified around the world that the power competition, particularly US and China, is going to be a significant risk for us in the future. And certainly from a military perspective, you look at what's happening in the South China Sea, the prospect there of future conflict or even interruption of critical things like supply chains is a concern. The more immediate concern I've been worried about here for us in Australia, and it's the one that was identified very well in a whole series of ASPI reports, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is the degree of foreign ownership of critical infrastructure in Australia. And examples there were the Darwin port that went out on this 99-year lease to a Chinese-owned company. In my view, that was absolutely daft. And we've seen the Foreign Investment Review Board have a greater degree of control and oversight since. But the ASPI reports did highlight the degree of electricity and gas network ownership from foreign companies. This is a problem, particularly if some aspects of control of those networks are taken offshore. We're now seeing aspects of our ports where port access and some functions are being offshored to the Philippines. We've got to get a bit of a common sense look at this. There are certain functions, systems, critical infrastructure where we must have control of that infrastructure in Australia. That doesn't mean we don't have foreign investment, but I think we've had too open approach to this, and we need to have a really serious look at that.
What about the Belt and Road Initiative with Victoria? Before we get to your comment on that, up until the last few days, I was thinking, yes, Victoria has acted quite naughty here. They'll be in the naughty corner for what they're doing, but it goes right back to 2017 with Australia that we were also engaging with China and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Having read part of what the Australian newspaper report was this morning, saying that, look, Victoria, in discussions with the Department of Foreign Affairs, took and interpreted or had the discussion that this wasn't going to be a problem. Now, if that is correct from the reports, I think what we're seeing here is an interesting problem. As a federation in our structure of state and federal responsibilities has shown some challenges in the past, and thankfully everyone's working as an integrated team right now to deal with COVID. That's really important. But you can get different perspectives, whether it's a defence view or a foreign affairs view or a domestic security view. And then you have to step back and say, okay, well, how do we guide this? What's our strategy of dealing with it? You know, we do not have a national security strategy in this country.
Really?
We had one back in 2013 for a little while. I was involved with some of the working groups to build it, but it was blown away by the Tony Abbott government. So what we really need is something that brings together not just a defence view or a foreign affairs or a domestic security. We need to have an integrated national security strategy. And Jim Molan's been talking about that a lot in the media in the last few months. So whether it's a national security strategy or national resilience strategy, you can't take separate views from separate departments or states if they are going to have a potential impact on our national security and resilience. We've got to have a way of dealing with it. Now, with our constitution, that needs a cooperative approach. But if we don't have that strategy in place and a vehicle to work around it, then we're all going to go off and work in stovepipes. And I think we're seeing the symptoms of that with this Belt and Road Initiative in Victoria.
And the other thing is with our defence, I mean, I see that, and there's two parts of this. I mean, we see that the submarines, we'll have those in about 35 years' time, and we've got frigates and stuff. So at the moment, we've got our submarines, the Oberon class, I think they're called, and it's really nice because we can at least notify the enemy that we're approaching because they can hear us. And then we have these new submarines, which are great because why use a perfectly good nuclear reactor or engine? We might as well just put some diesel in there from the Massey Ferguson, or someone said from the Victor lawnmower. Do you think that submarines are going to be enough? Do you think they're good enough? And do you think that we should probably act a bit faster, unless we have to write to the Chinese and Indonesians and others, look, don't attack us for another 35 years. We're not exactly ready just yet, so can you hang out just for a while?
Well, here's the reality of the world. With the size of our country in terms of population and economy, the only way we can achieve effective defence is with a team. And that's why the Five Eyes Alliance has been so important. That's why the relationship with the United States in a defence sense is absolutely critical. So the issue then, when you look across this, you need a defence capability, but if we look nationally at our resilience and our nation's defence beyond a military capability, that's where we've got a much more urgent problem. Now, people talk about let's double defence expenditure and it will act as a deterrent. Well, remember the relative sizes here of our countries and the threat. We will only ever be a deterrence as a part of an alliance force. And that means we've got to work with our regional neighbours a lot more closely. Where do I see the risk coming? If we allow this, back to the critical infrastructure bit, people to own this stuff. It's like we're in a house and we're going to put bars on the front of the house and we're going to deter someone from coming up by getting a bigger gun. That's going to scare them away. If you've allowed the enemy or the adversary to actually control the power supply coming to your house and the water supply and the gas supply, and you've let them go around the back door and get in through the back door and inside your computer systems in a cyber sense, then I don't care how big the gun is you're going to buy next year. It's not going to deter anybody if they're already inside your house. And that's the fundamental problem. We tend to look at it in a stovepipe, buy more defence capability because of this, instead of looking at the totality of it. Our more closer threat, near-time threat, is not a military conflict up in the South China Sea. It's losing control of our sovereignty where it matters. And that's where I think we should be focusing during the recovery, the economic recovery behind this virus. Where do we invest money? Where do we put the stimulus funds that improve our security, our resilience as a whole as a nation, not just focus at the project level, where there are issues, but we've got a bigger set of problems we've got to address sooner.
It's interesting days ahead. Would not like to be in Hong Kong right now, probably around Taiwan. Where else can I pick on? What about India? I mean, China, they're like parts of India and the South China Sea. It's all a bit nervy at the moment.
There is a lot of concern about it, but here comes the thing. Whilst we can react well, which is what we're doing, the most important thing is to take some principles out of defence. It's called preparedness. So let's try and learn something from this and all the previous inquiries we've had. How do we prepare better for the next crisis? It's not the same as this one. And in defence, it's called readiness and sustainability. So as a society, let's learn from this and prepare better, which is what we have failed to do repeatedly. The next thing is, in addition to preparing, is you've got to adapt. The world's changing. The reality is it is going to continue changing. So we need to adapt to it and accept the reality of that change and work out how we work better in that new world. And of course, the third layer is how do we prevent things going wrong if we can. But you can't have a society that's great at reacting if it doesn't prepare, adapt and prevent. And we haven't been very good at that because we've been too complacent. That's what I reckon we've got to focus on.
John Blackburn, great chatting. We'll do this more often. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Mark.
Hi, it's Brendan Nottle from the Salvos. For 140 years, we've stood with Australians in crisis. Today, as we all rise to the challenge of this heartbreaking time, the Salvos are doing all they can to ease the pain and find a way through for the people hardest hit. You can play a powerful role. If you're able, please go to salvationarmy.org.au and give to the Red Shield Appeal now. Together, we can do this.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
There's pressure on the federal government to divert some of the $60 billion JobKeeper savings into a package for the tourism sector. Chief Operating Officer for Accor Hotels Pacific, Simon McGrath, said people in the tourism sector needed to be kept on JobKeeper or some other assistance until at least December. Simon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak to you.
How important is continued financial support for tourist operators?
Look, I think it's very important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the tourism and hospitality sector played a big role in making sure that the community was safe by effectively shutting down their businesses as places of gathering. And I think that certainly went a long way to helping the health cause and the proud efforts of our nation in that sense. So that sector was very important in playing a key role. As a result of that, it was heavily impacted and in fact devastated, and that's still the case. We have seen recently some relaxation of restrictions, but let me assure you, those restrictions are minute compared to what they require to be fully fledged operating businesses. And again, the tourism industry is happy to play its role, and they understand that. That therefore means, though, that the economic sort of heavy lifting is being done by the tourism industry in terms of the downside. And I think in recognition for that, it's important. I mean, September will come about it very quickly. And, you know, it's important that we need a bridge to get people to December effectively. And that bridge is an extension of JobKeeper or any other fiscal support. I think the addition that the other most relevant point for our community is unemployment. There is no doubt from today onwards the tourism sector will continue to grow and prosper and gain momentum. But the reality is over the next 6 months, each month it will get better. But September as a point in time will still not be buoyant. And therefore, whilst we're worried about the operators, we're dreadfully worried about the employees in the sector. And I don't think to place them off JobKeeper in September is going to be a positive point in time. But if we can get people through to December, logically, it's going to be a much better point in time. It still will be a tough way back post that, and 2021 will be a continual gradual build. So I think, you know, what we want to do is try and get people into a December period, which is a much more positive period.
A dreadful time for everybody. But I think, I mean, having been in the tourist sector myself, I think you are probably you and education, international education, have just been walloped around the head and then jumped on just to make sure you don't wriggle. I don't really think the general public still understands the severity of this to the tourist industry. I think, you know, they think tourism, happy times, happy days, but it's like any business. If you haven't got a product to sell, you really haven't got a business.
Yeah, look, I make the point that I think you're right. There's been some public media about repatriated business going into hotels. There's some public media currently and sentiment around, you know, cafes open, 10 people in each. And, you know, again, the tourism sector's appreciative of those moves, but they would be probably 1/20th of the income required to make it fully fledged businesses. And yet, for the good of community, in many cases, these restaurants and bars and hotels and accommodation venues are opening. You know, they're opening and they're not making money today on 10 people, and yet they're out there because they know that they're a key piece of infrastructure for community, and everybody is also enjoying that. So, again, I think tourism is playing a beautiful role in lifting the spirits, but there's very little commercially that is coming back to an operator. And it's a real struggle, and it has been. It's probably been the most decimated sector. That being said, I can assure you it came into this period as a very, very strong sector, and it will continue to be. If anything that's happened throughout this crisis, it's, you know, everyone strips back their domestic and family budgets. The first thing I think I certainly am going to do, and I know many friends and family members that are going to do the same, the first thing we're going to put back in the family budget is a holiday or some hospitality and tourism back into our families. So resilient sector, strong sector, positive sector, but decimated. And I think we need to be very careful of the green shoots, thinking that those green shoots solve for everything. It's a long way back.
What about your other properties throughout the Pacific, thinking of Fiji and places like that? They must be also doing it very tough. To get to Fiji, it's an island. I mean, we're an island, but we've got a fairly large internal population. But Fiji, you need the planes or a very, very big yacht.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, we've seen New Zealand, Fiji, French Polynesia, and throughout Australia, the same level of devastation and occupancy is at a certain level. But you know, last week, the same level of excitement and great spirit and grit to open up these venues and get going. And we sit behind the decisions related to mass gatherings. We sit behind the decisions related to border closures and openings. And then we sit beside, you know, government may make those decisions. But frankly speaking, we sit behind the commercial drivers, as you rightly point out, transport, airlines, you know, and transport in general, and then community sentiment. So, you know, there's some way to go before we start to see that flow, but we're seeing the same economic impact right across the region. But, you know, as these things open up, so does the industry.
What steps is Accor taking now to get through, say, the next 6-12 months?
Look, obviously, we're making sure that our team members are engaged, making sure that they're positive, and make sure we're looking after them. Not only have we relied on JobKeeper to help our team members who are everything to our business, we've also had a grants program, and we've spent a significant amount of money issuing grants to families that are in need of our employees, and making sure that we care for those people that are in desperate need, and some are more desperate than others. So that's first and foremost, and will always be the foundation of our business. The second part to that is we've developed a health and safety programs for our business, and we proudly have rolled those out across the business. So any guests coming into any of our hotels can faithfully rely on those procedures that it's safe. And I think whilst I don't think the health and safety aspects will completely restrict the business from trading, but it will be an element that people will consider, and it'll be a personal issue. So for those people who wish to come into an environment that's endorsed and certified, they'll have that. So our customers can rely on that. The next part of it is we're working with all governments to help them with policy. And then, the third part is communication and welcoming back of our loyal guests. We've got 5 million loyalty members. We've stayed connected with them throughout COVID, and we're starting to get the right messaging back. We're packaging up the right product for them. We're opening up food and beverage as we can, and delivering them packages that are relevant. And I think the type of tourism that we'll see most immediately is a very genuine, authentic tourism that brings families and friends together, because it's certainly what we've missed. And the tourism sector, again, will play an incredible role in making our community just feel better about itself and enjoying the best of Australia and the region.
Growing market is the Chinese market, bit of a stoush China with probably half the world at the moment. Are you a little nervous? Yeah. Will that impact Accor?
Yeah, look, no, not really. I mean, we operate in China and we have a very successful run rate at that. I'm more concerned for our economy. I think, the Australian economy relies on many, many different countries to prosper. So we've got to watch the eye on that. But from a tourism sense throughout the Pacific region, let me remind you, it's sort of largely domestic. It's 80% domestic, 20% international. And that international spread is evenly across US, UK, Southeast Asia and so on. And the Chinese market represented 4 to 5% of our business. So it's been a good market. We enjoy it as we do in education, but it doesn't, we've got a balanced sort of portfolio of guests that we welcome. And what we're relying on, interestingly, the trend is that, we've had 9 million inbound visits to Australia every year, but correspondingly we've had 10 million outbound visits going abroad, the great Australian traveller that's known around the world. And to some degree, with the international borders closed, there's a wonderful opportunity for the domestic tourism to actually, particularly in regional areas, which I think is so important, to really get out and discover Australia. And we've long stated that in Australian tourism, but it's always been a healthy lure to get people overseas. But we now have a situation where, possibly the domestic traveller and that patriotic traveller could really fill the void of the international travellers. And we were a net exporter of tourism. So, if we can really appeal to those 10 million outbound visits a year that Australians had, there's a fair bit of business for domestically.
Simon McGrath, Chief Operating Officer for Accor Hotels Pacific, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Coronavirus is most likely to spread from person to person when we come into close contact with one another. We can all help stop the spread by keeping our distance. This means do not shake hands or exchange physical greetings, and wherever possible, stay at least 1.5 metres away from others. It's also really important to practice good hygiene, especially after being in public places. Together, we can help stop the spread and stay healthy. Visit health.gov.au to learn more. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Professor Nikolai Petrovsky is Professor of Medicine at Flinders University and is set to become the first researcher in Australia to trial a COVID-19 vaccine in humans within weeks. He is also the founder of Vaccine, a company funded by the US National Institutes of Health to develop novel vaccine technologies. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
What is a novel vaccine?
Well, at the moment, we don't have a proven vaccine against COVID-19. So arguably any successful vaccine that eventuates will be a novel vaccine of some form or other.
You and your company are leading the charge in Australia to develop the first COVID-19 vaccine, which is COVAX-19. Tell me, how have you managed this so quickly?
I think you need to appreciate it. A typical vaccine takes 15 years to develop. So the only way in which you can develop a vaccine faster than that is if you have most of the technology and components already sorted out so that you're ready to go from day one. So for the last 16 years, we've been funded by the United States National Institutes of Health to assemble essentially those components of a pandemic vaccine. The antigen platform of how we make the protein that is going to form the vaccine, and also what we call the adjuvant component, which is the turbocharger that we need to add to that protein to make the immune system recognize it. So we've done that multiple times in the past for particularly seasonal influenza and pandemic influenza, which obviously changes from year to year. So you need a robust platform to deal with those changes. And that means that we can essentially very rapidly develop a vaccine against any new pandemic. And so we were able to use that platform to develop COVAX-19, which, as you mentioned, is our vaccine candidate against COVID-19.
You're going to trial healthy people. Just tell me how this works and what further processes do you have to go through before you can actually manufacture it?
So the important thing to realise is that we don't in any way expose subjects in our clinical trials to any viruses, neither in the vaccine itself nor after they've had the vaccine. So essentially, in order to test the vaccine in humans, what we need to do is we give them the injection of the vaccine, which is a synthetic protein. And then we're able to measure the development of antibodies in their blood, which are markers of whether or not they would be protected if they were exposed to the COVID-19 virus. So it's really they get a few injections in their arm, and then a month after they've had the injections, we take just a simple blood test. And that will tell us whether the vaccine's working or not. So we don't need to expose them to the virus to know if the vaccine's working.
So how long will it then take to get this onto the market, and will the incredible level of investment be required quickly?
So time is everything in a pandemic, and I think, everyone's impatient to have a vaccine available, and obviously we're fully aware of that. So we're trying to do things as fast as humanly possible. But, there's some things that, you simply can't skip. And clearly we need to show in clinical trials that our vaccine is certainly safe and that it's likely to be effective. So that process will take generally 3 to 4 months. And we should have a result from the blood tests well before the end of this year. We then, will need to do even larger clinical trials. So, they may take anywhere from 3 to 4 months. And then once you have, data on at least several thousand people in the clinical trials, at that point you can seek approval of the vaccine to be given, more generally. So it's certainly not going to happen overnight, but by early next year we would expect that our vaccine, if everything goes to plan, will be at the stage of that final approval stage. And of course, then the challenge is how to manufacture enough vaccine quickly, and that's a massive challenge. That it can't be underestimated, and while the clinical trials themselves are quite expensive, particularly as they get into the thousands of subjects, those trials can cost anywhere from $20 million to $400 million. That's the typical price to do those clinical trials, so that's not cheap. And obviously manufacturing and building a manufacturing facility to produce tens or hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines is similarly not a cheap exercise. So there does need to be considerable investment, even once we have a successful vaccine, to make that vaccine widely available.
Do we have any other places that could probably do this besides China, or are we going to have to stick with China?
So interestingly, China is one of the world's biggest drug producers, but it's actually a relatively small vaccine producer. If you look at volume of vaccines, then the biggest producer is India, followed by the United States and Europe, and then Japan. So in fact, China doesn't figure prominently in terms of global vaccine supply. They only produce vaccine for their own local market. They typically don't export it. So in this case, China is not really critical, I don't believe, to global vaccine supplies. As I say, places like India, Europe, and the United States are going to be more important.
China's not being very helpful in sharing information on the virus itself. How much has this sort of slowed the development of a vaccine?
Well, I would actually disagree. Certainly Chinese scientists have produced the vast majority of the papers that have been published on the virus to date, and have been making those papers available on pre-press servers, so you don't have to wait for them to come out in the formal publication. So I have to say I've found the data that they have shared to be extremely useful in both understanding the virus and also in preparing our own vaccine candidate. So I think, certainly from a scientific perspective, as I say, China has contributed an enormous amount of data to the world for us to understand this virus.
See, there's still fake news out there.
I know they're being accused of maybe not sharing some of the very earliest experience from late last year when the virus was just starting. But, as I say, from January onwards, Chinese scientists like us, science is a competitive area. You want to get the scoop. And so Chinese scientists have been flooding, as I say, the scientific journals with papers on their research. So, and that I'm not aware in any way that's been, suppressed or not encouraged, because I guess China would like to be a world leader in science as well. And it wouldn't make sense for them to stop their scientists being able to publish their data.
Look, you've made some comments about the characteristics of this virus being very well adapted to humans. This being so, why did so many scientists dismiss the possibility that maybe the virus was from a lab?
So at the moment, we obviously, simply don't know where the virus came from. So there's no conclusive evidence of how did it happen. And that's not unusual early in a pandemic. It takes time to do the detective hunts, to trace down where the virus came from, and most commonly that would be from some wild animal population. But, there have been episodes where viruses and other pathogens have leaked out of laboratories in the past due to an accident, and we can't dismiss that possibility here. We're not saying that it's necessarily probable, but we're just saying it is one possibility that needs to be excluded. Now, as to some of my colleagues who jumped in very early with really no science to support their claims and said categorically this couldn't be a result of a laboratory leak, I can only presume that they were speaking from I guess perhaps more political perspective rather than a scientific perspective. And you would have to interview them to understand why they chose to make those statements, which I don't believe were founded on solid science.
How risky is this type of research being done by China on viruses? Are viruses of this type grown anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, so, these viruses, which are what we call high pathogenicity viruses, so they include Ebola and Marburg, and the avian influenza strains that we hear about that cause human deaths, and a whole variety of exotic viruses that we know are highly lethal if animals or humans are exposed to them, are studied in facilities around the world. They're high security facilities that are designed for that specific purpose. Obviously, we have one right here in Geelong in Australia. And so, yes, I mean, these viruses are studied in most countries of the world. They're not restricted to China.
Back to COVID-19. From now, the test, the trials, I would imagine the licensing, the manufacturing, about how long we have to wait?
So the answer is I cannot see any vaccine being widely available before the end of this year. So I think we have to, bar a miracle, it simply, takes longer than that. By early next year, I expect, to have vaccines, and we're obviously hoping ours is one of them, start to be made available. But of course, again, you can't make billions of doses overnight. You have to plan to manufacture it over, probably a number of years to get extensive coverage of everyone on the globe. So essentially, you have to then strategize and say, well, who gets the vaccine first? I'm confident we'll have a vaccine, and supplies will start to flow, next year. But of course, then we have to decide how do we, determine who should get it first. Should it be travellers? Because, if you have to travel from Australia to even the United States right now, you'd want to be vaccinated. So you don't bring the virus back home when you return. And so, maybe we immunise people who are travelling first, particularly if they're travelling to high-risk places. Mm-hmm. It's the same as getting a yellow fever vaccine if you're going to South America. I mean, the average Australian doesn't get a yellow fever vaccine because, Australia doesn't have yellow fever. So it may well be if we have no COVID-19 in Australia, we only need to immunise the people who are planning to travel outside of Australia. Obviously, if the people who are at the front line, so the doctors and nurses, even if we don't have many cases in Australia, they are at the highest risk of coming into contact with a case, and so you would obviously seek to immunise them early on. And then finally, if there still is COVID-19 around in the community, then we know that it's highly lethal for people who are elderly. The mortality rates in people over 80 is somewhere around 25%, so 1 in 4 will die from it. So obviously they should be the people we should be protecting with our vaccine next. So in terms of you, I gather you're not over 80 and you're not working in a hospital. Maybe you are planning to travel, but obviously that would determine when you're likely to get a vaccine, and that may be still a year and a half or even 2 years away.
My travel is to a supermarket, so I'm not going anywhere. But look, I have to ask you this. I mean, the media, I truly think the media has been appalling in the reporting of this. It's looking for that clickbait. Have we been caught up in the hype of the sensationalism or the over-reporting or the dramatic reporting from the media? I mean, you're a scientist. You see it as it is. So what do you think?
Yeah, so look, from day one, I was just following the statistics, and the statistics haven't lied and have stayed consistent even from when China reported, this back in early January. They were looking at between 1% and 3% mortality rates, and that's held true to this day. The reason we've had so few deaths in Australia is that we've taken a lot of actions to control the virus, so there's very little virus. If we were to take the opposite approach and just say, well, let the virus spread through the community, then, you only have to multiply the population of Australia at 25 million by, between, 1 and 3%, and that will tell you how many deaths we can expect. That's an awful lot of deaths. That's somewhere between 100 and 300,000 people. So the reason we have such a low death rate is we've taken appropriate action. And similarly for other countries that have taken it seriously and have, done everything in their power to stop the spread of the virus. If we look at countries which haven't taken that approach, and I guess, the leading examples are the United States, Italy, United Kingdom, who initially, were very complacent and had bought this story that this was no worse than a case of the flu. And you look at the mortality rates in those countries, and they're very big numbers, 100,000 plus in the United States, over 30,000 deaths in the United Kingdom and Italy. And, they're still only a small way into this pandemic. Don't think that's the death rate's just going to stop there. If you let this virus keep circulating in your community, the death toll is just going to keep rising. And, on our projections, you'd be looking at millions of deaths in the United States, hundreds of thousands of deaths in places like UK and Italy. So, and similarly Australia. So, yeah, the problem was back in January, people said, oh, well, no one's died of this, so the flu's much worse, which makes no sense because the flu obviously circulated the whole year. And at that point, the virus, Covid-19, had only been circulating in some places for less than a week. And, of course, the death rate's low. But you have to base it on the statistics, as I say, that were already available from China telling us what the real mortality rate was. And as I say, that hasn't changed if you look at the numbers today. So that, the part of the press that was trying to say this was no worse than a case of flu, I think caused terrible damage. And you could argue they are responsible for already hundreds of thousands of deaths in those countries that really listened to that press story.
And then we could also talk about the economic impact. It's a tricky one there because, we could say we need to open the economy, but if we all get sick, we're not going to open the economy because there's not much left. And if we don't open the economy, there's not much left. So it's a really tricky situation. I'm going to place my bet on you because we need you to work really, really hard, and you can send me the first vaccine.
Absolutely. Look, and I guess that's what we've been saying since January is the only way the world has out of this is with a successful vaccine. There never was going to be any other solution to resolve both the health problems, but as you say, the economic problems. And just really the big surprise is how little investment there has been in vaccines so far. When we're talking $15 trillion of economic damage to date, and the investment in vaccines is 0.01% of that economic, damage. There should be a lot more investment in vaccines, I think, all around the world, and because a vaccine is the only way out.
Hi, it's Brendan Nottle from the Salvos. For 140 years, we've stood with Australians in crisis. Today, as we all rise to the challenge of this heartbreaking time, the Salvos are doing all they can to ease the pain and find a way through for the people hardest hit. You can play a powerful role. If you're able, please go to salvationarmy.org.au and give to the Red Shield Appeal now. Together, we can do this.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Cheryl Ng is the managing editor of the Epoch Times in Hong Kong and has been with the Epoch Times since 2002 when the Hong Kong Bureau was established. It's one of the largest independent Chinese language news media groups in the world, covering 21 languages and 33 countries. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you, Mike.
You had a situation last year where the newspaper was withdrawn from 7-Eleven stores throughout Hong Kong. Tell us about this.
We started in Hong Kong as a free newspaper. So last year we had the chance, changing from a free newspaper to a paid one. And so we chose 7-Eleven to launch our newspaper. And it started in April 1st. But like few months down the road, they all of a sudden using unreasonable reason to stop, to take us off the shelf.
Do you think this was because of the China ruling party?
Definitely. Ever since we were established in Hong Kong, we've been meeting with all the challenges came from the suppressions from the CCP. It was done in a subtle way. They always give you, say, it's a business decision. Say, for example, when we changed from weekly to daily in 2005, they said we had a printing shop who print the paper for us, but then they pressed the printing shop and stopped printing paper for us. So at the end, of course, we have very difficult time finding another printing shop to print for us. So eventually we had our printing shop later, a year later. So but of course, when we talked to the printing shop, they refused to tell us anything, any pressure from the CCP. They only said it's a business decision.
It's ominous times in Hong Kong. China's controversial national security laws for Hong Kong have been called a killer blow to the city's autonomy and freedoms.
Right. As our legislator, Dennis Kwok, said, it's the end of one country, two system officially.
Tell us what this means in practical terms for Hong Kong.
I think when the one country, two system promise to Hong Kong was done, the Hong Kong people was hoping that they can continue their way of life. I think the Hong Kong situation is very much like a civilized city in Asia. We enjoy everything that the Western world treasure. So that's why they have the two system. So we don't want to go back to the tyranny system in China. So we want to maintain what we used to have when the British was ruling. So when they enact this, or they just pass this resolution, in China of the national security law, it basically it's the ending of the free lifestyle that we have. And I think the most important thing is the core values. All these years, Hong Kong people has been fighting to defend our core values, because it's the core values that we treasure that is in work that we can maintain the systems. So it's meaning the core values that we treasured is now trashed.
And this obviously is something that most people are scared of too, these new national security laws.
I think it's not so much. We've been through the situation, similar situation in 1997, when the handover happened. Before the handover, you can see the wave of immigration, migration to overseas countries. But I think this round, especially after this movement in last year, the Hong Kong people has a little bit think a little bit differently this time, because of course there's still migration wave. People were moving to other countries, but some people in Hong Kong also decide that yes, we love this place. We'll defend it to the very end of it.
What's the mood throughout the various communities in Hong Kong today? Local politicians, legal and professional class, the business groups. How is it?
I think even in last year, Hong Kongers realized that we cannot fight the battle on our own. We need the help from international society. Because I think a critic just said, the critics just said Hong Kong is nowadays Jerusalem. So it's where we preserve a core value that the world treasures. And if we lose Hong Kong, we lose everything. The world loses too. Because as you see the pandemic, how the CCP handles the pandemics, so it's targeting everyone. It's targeting America. superpower that is of not equal strength, but it's the major player in today's world. So you see, like I think we're still expecting like help from international society, and things is not quite firmed at the moment. You see, we'll wait and see. But of course, like we know that the America is probably going to announce their moves on over the weekend.
It's where business does business, and it's worked for years and years and years. Why would the CCP jeopardize all that?
I think, first of all, the mentality of the CCP is very different from the rest of the world. Of course, it's our wishful thinking that like they also treasure the economy, the growth, and flourish with everyone. But in their mindset, they want absolute control of power. So they're not just aiming at Hong Kong, they're aiming at the whole world. They want an absolute control on the whole world. So Hong Kong is fighting at the frontier right now. So why they target Hong Kong? First of all, Hong Kong is a stage where this American versus China CCP is taking place. It's a manifestation of the conflicts. It becomes a battlefield, and because the Hong Kong people, the CCP found that they cannot control the Hong Kong people, and the Hong Kong people is connect with the international society. So they want to sacrifice Hong Kong in that sense to gain control of Hong Kong, so that there is one less or one major uncertainty removed for them. And they are believe me, they are struggling to survive, the CCP in China, especially after the pandemic, when they have caused such a life loss in the world and economic loss, and everyone is going after them. So they want to, at least in their emotions, they feel they want to be secured, that they control everything now. So Hong Kong is one great uncertainty for them. So they, even at the cost of economic loss, but of course, like they think that they can still use Hong Kong as a hub to generate money for them. But don't forget that Hong Kong enjoys the present status is because, say for example, the Hong Kong Policy Act. Americans, it's giving Hong Kong preferential treatments, and recognize Hong Kong as a financial hub. But if America withdraw that, they probably cannot use Hong Kong to generate the economic benefits that they would love to see, and they are struggling in their economy as well.
What about major enterprises throughout Hong Kong or the major companies from the world? A lot of those are headquartered in Hong Kong. How do you feel that they feel about this whole scenario just unraveling?
Of course, like I'm with these. If this law is eventually taken place, the business environment would be very different in Hong Kong. Also, although they said like it will remain the same, but looking at they have this law that takes effect where they restrict on like the number of people gathered in public. They actually use this law to suppress the dissidents. So they can use the law in any way, and they like to target anyone. So of course business will not be as usual, and they can feel the pinch maybe very soon if it actually takes place. But of course, there's still uncertainty of how this thing will turn, though.
The laws aimed at curbing foreign interference. Which groups are most likely to be targeted, and how will your media be affected?
I think people would automatically think about Falun Gong in Hong Kong because it's being suppressed in China. But of course, if you think further, it's the media, say Epoch Times, Apple Daily, who would not who would report the true news, right? And then the dissidents, people who do not agree, the NGO, people are fighting, for democracies in Hong Kong, and basically, eventually, everyone will be touched if we don't defend ourselves.
Carrie Lam, Is she a figure of much disrespect? And do people believe what she's saying, that only a small number of people will be affected by the law?
Of course, people are very disappointed, with Carrie Lam. And of course, there's a lot of very angry people, of what she's done to Hong Kong. People feel that she has failed Hong Kong people in defending our rights when she's facing the Beijing Bureau. When she said, it's only a small number of people who will be affected, she is saying what the CCP is saying, it's a carrot and stick tactics that the CCP has used. They always said that they are trying to target only a small portion of people, and we if you've read the 9 commentaries we've published in 2004, which is about the true nature of the CCP, this is always the 5%, 95% versus the 5%. So they would define the 5%, and people will feel that, I'm safe. I don't fall into the 5% category. I'll never fit that category. But don't forget that CCP can make anyone become the 5% category, whatever in the way they like. So no one is safe at the end. So she is lying. She's lying for the CCP, and we also feel that the Hong Kong officers, including Carrie Lam, is talking more and more in the party language, we say.
How do you see it impacting on economic activity, property prices, population movement, business confidence? And just on the subject of population movement, will you be able to leave Hong Kong if once the CCP puts its foot down even more heavily than it is now? What do you do?
It's not clear yet. But of course, when the first round happened in 1997, I think there's a lot of the Hong Kongers that's having a foreign passport. So these people, it's probably no problem when they leave, if they want to leave Hong Kong. I think if worst come to worst, then the people in Hong Kong would have a hard time to leave Hong Kong. They have to apply, for immigration, the application to other countries. But I think the difficulty would be similar to the ones who are in mainland China right nowadays. I don't see but I don't want to make a very definite prediction on this, because I just feel that it's a lot of things. It's still really depending on what the American is taking, the actions that the Americans are taking, and we don't know. Maybe it can cause the downfall of the CCP because it's already in a very fragile situation. And I think it seems like they are very definite in their actions, but what I see is an action that similar to people who are struggling for life and death.
You were with the Epoch Times in Hong Kong, 2002, 18 years ago. How has the essence or the soul of Hong Kong changed in those 18 years?
It's definitely getting worse and worse. At the first few years after the handover, I would say lifestyle is pretty much similar. Although, as working for Epoch Times and being Epoch Times in Hong Kong, we always feel the suppression. But it seems like other sectors of the community is still running pretty okay. But then you can see it's escalating. It's getting worse and worse. And now it has come to a really boiling point, I would say. The CCP, first they play by the rules, and, they try to fill into that, try to say, keep the promise. But now they don't really give a damn. They don't care about this anymore. They just want to do what they do. And you can see the eagerness in themselves, meaning that they are very weak.
It's almost like a bully boy, isn't it? The bully in the schoolyard, and we'll beat our chest, and you'll jump to our every whim. I can't really see the fight against the might of the CCP. I can't see it winning unless you have support from the other countries, such as US, Australia, Europe, all the others, they need to pitch in and say to China, you cannot do that.
That's true, because at the surface, it's like the Hong Kong people is defending for themselves, for their rights. But as I said before, we are defending for core values that the world treasure. And it's very, actually Hong Kong is a very precious place for the world, because the mentality in Hong Kong, the standards in Hong Kong is like such a city doesn't build in one day. It took years to build. So it can see like this is a precious frontier for the world to face the CCP. And as you see that the CCP's, like I said, the CCP's ambition is not in Hong Kong, it's the world. It's targeting the world.
As with the South China Sea, with Taiwan, with India, they've become a lot more aggressive of late. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.